So, hey omnes, I am Ruminous, and today we are going over the gameplay aspect of difficulty. This ought to be fun. Now, if you are one of those get good people who like to belittle people for playing games however they want, leave. Go away. I don't have sympathy for you. This is not for you. Go ahead, leave. I assure you, you're not gonna have fun here, because I'm gonna talk about how to make games to a wider audience, including casual people. This is also, I will go into, get good behavior, but this is also about how to make the difference between frustration and challenging, where challenging is fun and frustration, which is often what get good is not. Get good to me is the mentality of, I like things to be overly punishing, to not give me any sort of lenience, and that's fine. If you like those type of things, that's fine. But this is not the video for you. Second, along with that, if you're planning to make a video game, you need to plan out what is your intended audience, what is your intended difficulty setting. If you're making a walking simulator, you probably want to make it a very easy, casual difficulty. You don't want to have a lot of conflict, you don't want to have a lot of stress, because the people that play those games don't want that. On the other hand, if you're making a racing game, a fighting game, or any sort of really tense, really strict game, you do want some sort of get good difficulty, because the people that play those games like to be challenged. Those are the people that actually like to get good and like to practice the same move in a fighting game for 30 years to get it right, whereas most people don't. So know your audience, know your difficulty, and know what you want to reach. For the most part though, I'm going to go over the general games that have conflict and action, and to show kind of how you can kind of gear your game in order to have casual and get good behaviors so that you can reach the max amount of people. Difficulty is a tough concept to fully develop and understand in a game. There is a strange dichotomy within the community, which is split into two factions. We have the casuals, who kind of pick up games when they can. They may have 1 or 2 hours a week, a month, a year. These are people who don't really play games often, they don't keep up with the news, they don't really care. They kind of just see a game, looks nice, they play it. They play it typically on the easiest difficulty because they don't care. They just want to beat the game and go through it. They don't want to be challenged, and they don't really want to learn the specific gameplay aspects and mechanics of the game. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the hobbyists, who are obviously the opposite of that. These are people who make games a central part of their life, will often play games every day or close to it, and will often schedule time and be competitive, do all these things in order to maximize their fun with games. Hobbyists are the people who often will play games on the hardest difficulties. They are achievement hunters or trophy hunters. These are the people who will maximize your game if it is well designed and good. So this is why, when I mentioned before, you want to reach both audiences. You want people who are just going to randomly play the game because they'll buy it and go, that was fun, and then put it down. And then you also want the people who will buy it and then squeeze every bit of fun out of it, which is good for them. And then they'll be waiting in anticipation for your next game. So you can see where you're going to need to develop, or at least try to, develop and plan for both these audiences, because if someone casually plays it, you reach an impact with them and go, that was nice, and then they'll see the 2 next to their next title, and they'll want to play that again. And whereas the hobbyist will actually keep up with it, but they'll still be waiting for your game, and these are the ones who actually will give feedback on your game, on what was good and what wasn't. The point of mentioning all of this is to explain the conflict of perception of difficulty in the games, which I will get into momentarily. Not gonna retaliate? Just gonna take it? Ow! Ow! I already regret it. Dark Souls is a famous set of games where the difficulty is considered intense. These games are not the first to attempt harsh difficulty, but they are a major game which did it well. As I'll mention later with mechanics, many games will lean towards changing stats and abilities to mess with difficulty, which can indeed make it harder, but there's a clear line and can also push into the realm of frustrating really quickly. These issues with difficulties, which are not always easy to fix, often revolve around the difference between challenging and frustrating. After playing and replaying multiple games, the harder or more punishing difficulties are enjoyed by hobbyists when the experience is challenging, but all despise the experience when the experience is frustrating, except for those who really just hate their lives. Challenging gameplay revolves around testing the player's knowledge of the mechanics and the gameplay aspects of the game, but every action performed by the game and the player feels fair and balanced. If the player loses or is stumped by a puzzle, the player never feels like the game is unfair, ridiculous, or imbalanced. or that the solution to the puzzle makes sense. Challenging gameplay revolves around testing a player's knowledge of the mechanics of the game, but every action performed by the game and the player feels fair and balanced. If the player loses or is stumped by a puzzle, the player never feels like the game is unfair, ridiculous, or imbalanced. If they cheat and look up an answer to a puzzle, there should be an, "Oh, that makes sense" moment instead of a, "What the hell is this garbage nonsense?" Look at those hands. Frustrating is obviously the opposite, where the game feels biased against the player and is just berating the character in an attempt to make it harder. Therefore, frustrating difficulty is all about trial and error until the game gives a win or the player admits defeat and moves on to a new game, whereas challenging gameplay always has an option or opportunity for success, even if unclear at the beginning. Reducing resources and limiting stats to the player can be challenging, but there's also a point where it becomes frustrating when the player has just enough or not enough to succeed even with perfection. For most games, challenging difficulty rests heavily upon the various levels of AI. As the difficulty increases, the adaptability and awareness and the skills of the AI should also increase. Games with puzzles, survival, and tactics can implement some random or alternate routes to increase the challenge. Reorganizing the placement of items or randomizing the combinations or requiring extra components to a puzzle can introduce extra difficulty and add a variety to the more linear games. Challenging gameplay for platformers will make the enemies have slight gaps in between them to escape damage, and they will have long jumps between the platforms, but there's always a chance for success. Tactic games will make the enemies hard to hit, racing games will make sharp curves or faster opponents, puzzle games will obscure answers or have longer components. However, a key aspect to challenging gameplay is that the mechanics and abilities used early in the game are still useful and act in the same way. Challenging sections are supposed to push players to the limit, testing their knowledge of the different mechanics and gameplay aspects in the game. New enemies or mechanics in these sections follow the same rules and principles as the rest of the game, so the player is not blindsided and confused. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Ow. Frustrating gameplay for shooters will make the enemies have incredulous aim and an infinite supply of explosive. Action games will reduce the checkpoints or remove them entirely. RPGs will make the enemies have absurd stats. Enemies should become aware of what becomes effective and what is dangerous for them. However, some developers give enemies unlimited opportunities for devastating abilities, which quickly becomes frustrating since the player doesn't have the option to do the same thing and can't manage the overwhelming attacks constantly. Frustrating sections will break the rules or introduce new aspects of the game without proper experimentation, so that the player is forced to sit and torture until they finally manage to figure out and succeed, perhaps by luck of the draw rather than skill. It is also my personal opinion that developers should test games at the highest difficulty, as that's where the cracks in the design show. Where the enemy pressure is too much, the autosaves are too infrequent or too frequent, or the design is just not properly thought out. So, the core difference between them is all about autonomy, which is the core of enjoyment for these games. Challenges test the player, while frustration berates the player. Every game should have some sort of randomness to it, but the outcome of randomly generated aspects should never become impossible to defeat. Spelunky has randomly generated areas based on a series of different layouts, but the developer was smart enough to specifically design the engine to read the layout and make sure that the openings and pathways would never be obstructed, that you weren't soft-locked in the game. Resident Evil 2 from 2019 has some random placement of zombies in specific rooms where it can be difficult or impossible to react to a grab, even if the player knows that the zombie is there, although these are so infrequent that it hardly impacts the overall enjoyment of the game. I hate you! I can't tell how many times I failed this when I was like 8 playing this goddamn game. This is ridiculously hard. Ah, Jesus. I can't do anything. I can't do reaction commands. Oh, this is all over. I'm fucked. Actually, I might win it. I might get it. I might do it. Go to a finish. This game is garbage. This game is butt sauce. Kingdom Hearts 2 has a boss where he can initiate a move where he becomes invulnerable while little beings of water dance around. But the frustrating part is that there's also a time limit. Yay! That just barely lets the player win. If the player is unaware of this attack, and is unaware of the faster method, which use fire by the way, which is never explained or hinted at in the game, the player will lose repeatedly until they manage to get an attempt where the waters are close enough together and die quickly. Difficulty is a hard aspect to manipulate. To do specific changes and alter the experience completely to test the player takes a large amount of time and testing, which developers rarely ever have. To do a lot of stuff with the AI that I mentioned, it takes a lot of programming expertise and financial burden, which obviously becomes a problem, and that's why messing with the stats just becomes easier. It's a lot easier to change some of the stats and from a programming perspective than it is to actually just plan and test a whole new AI outlook. A decent method for developers to give players the options to choose certain mechanics, like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where there are standard difficulties, but there's also specific settings for the combat, the puzzles, and exploration that the player can manipulate. I've also mentioned with certain settings and certain mechanics that you can mess with that actually change the difficulty without making it frustrating or just straight stat-based. And so, messing with stats to make the player beat the game faster without mistakes or make an enemy stronger is the easier way to toughen the game up. Sometimes this works, other times it just makes the game tedious and annoying. In reality, if the game's harder difficulties are not fun, they should be scrapped. Otherwise, the hobbyists who enjoy a challenge tend to automatically go to those modes and get frustrated at the game. One of Superhot's challenges requires the player to beat all 20 plus levels without dying. Although it quickly starts out as a challenge, testing the memory and the skill of the player, the fact that enemies can attack before appearing on screen, that it takes 30 plus minutes to complete the challenge, that the other 10 plus challenges before went through the same levels with similar restrictions, causes frustration, on top of the fact that there needs to be room for human or computer error. When I taught, I allowed any makeup work without any penalty for it, because it was all worthwhile for you to do. If I punished you and said, you only get 50% if you turn this in late, what's the point of doing it? That becomes frustrating because the work is the same, there's no difference in it, it's just a time-based thing, and that's where it becomes frustrating, and I take an issue with teachers that take off a lot of late work. I understand if you take maybe 5 or 10% off for, you gotta keep a schedule and you gotta teach them some adult things, but taking off a lot, it just discourages people from actually doing the work. Many games have the same type of challenges, and they're always frustrating because the game never really makes a mistake, and it hardly is ever worth it to complete these tasks. Sometimes the game will not register properly, the buttons on the controller will not register, or what typically happens is that there's player error. Look, I understand that sometimes the game will mess up, but typically it is player error. What these do is force the player to look for cracks in the system, how to glitch and cheese the game, rather than test their abilities. It's not worth the risk 30 minutes of work on the last few levels, as they typically just want to be done at this point. These challenges often don't teach or reinforce anything besides raw memory, especially since most of the challenges before go through the levels anyway. If the game requires completing 7 levels in a row in one run, that can be a challenge, but all 26 levels is just a burden, and belabors the point. I've proven that I can beat the first 10 levels, but the 11th gives me an aneurysm. Why make me redo all of it just for the 11th level? Many reports and research show that repeating tasks and homework are helpful, but only to a certain extent. If a student has to do mounds of the same math problem, there's a certain point, around 15 to 30 minutes, where afterwards, there's actually no benefit. For example, when I did my practice and homework, I designed it so that it reinforced the core important skills and so that it could be solved within 10 minutes if the student was exceptionally talented. For most students, it would take around 30 minutes, and for the lower performing students, it might take around 45 minutes with notes. Sometimes I've failed, but usually I hit around that mark. The first set of problems are true false basically. If the problem has an exponent, quadratic. If it's not, linear. The only problems that come along with that are the last two, where you actually have to do some math rather than just look at it. It's possible to do in 1 minute for those who know why, 5 minutes with notes with the rules explained. The 4 problems at the bottom are a little more difficult and take a little more work, but they can be easily done either with the basic rules from your notes or with a graphing calculator that you're also allowed to use on test. If you're using random values, it will take some time, but it's possible. Overall, if using the notes and practice in class, it shouldn't take more than 15-30 minutes for a new learner and doesn't convolute with unnecessary work. Horizon Zero Dawn managed to achieve a good scale for its difficulty. Horizon will increase damage to the player, but will not reduce damage to the enemies, which means that the player needs to be more defensive, but the battles will last just as long without becoming a drag or a nuisance. The enemies will also become smarter by routing the character and becoming more aggressive in the higher difficulties, forcing the player to adopt some new tactics and use different mechanics in the game. In the highest difficulties, stealth is more strict and requires the character to be more careful, as enemies will be more realistic and detect the character quickly. All these components together add in different experiences on every difficulty, although there are moments on the higher difficulties where the damage received is just too much, but those are infrequent if the player is improving the armor and appropriately using all the mechanics and the gameplay aspects available in the game. So the good news is that I've been practicing a bit more, and I'm actually a little bit better at the game. The bad news is that I'm still woefully incompetent. So let's see how this goes. Dragon Ball FighterZ models the typical format of frustrating difficulties in fighting games. As the enemies reach higher levels, they do more damage, receive less damage, gain more energy for special moves, and also use more advanced moves, know when the players are open and where the player will be, and react at a human possible speed. The statistics grow at an exponential rate, and the AI becomes so quick and fast that not even the fastest players can manage to properly fight against the AI. A single mistake or even error in the game's processes can result in a loss, which can be minutes of work because the damage given to the enemy is so slight. Having the AI be able to do so much would be fine and teach the player what they can do, but the manipulated stats make the enemies overwhelmingly powerful, and it doesn't really give you a chance to test out new things, to learn some new mechanic, or, as in the Horizon Zero Dawn example, to play more defensively, because you don't get that chance. This leads to players giving up, or looking for glitches or cheats in the game to be able to succeed, as managing a win legitimately requires a massive amount of luck, which means the player is not properly learning or practicing mechanics available in the game. Difficulty in a game should aim to challenge the player's skills that they've learned so far. Challenge comes from the idea that a player can actually achieve success even if they fail, whereas frustrating is when the game feels biased against the player or just gives the enemies, puzzles, or races far too much power compared to the player. We play games to escape a bit, have fun, and many of us like a challenge, but very few people like to be brutally punished repeatedly. Test games on the highest difficulty to see where the enemies need to be repositioned, scaled down, levels need to be remapped, which puzzles need more guidance, where auto-save should happen, all of these sorts of things. Remember that frustration is when the player is disengaged, not immersed, and basically feels like the game is just randomly throwing things at them and there's nothing that they can do to change it. Whereas challenging is, I see what I need to do and I just need to practice more in order to get there. And again, there is a fine line sometimes between them and also between the people that perceive them. Some people just don't care to maximize their skills in a game, and that's fine, but just make sure that you plan for the game that you're going to make. If you want to make a very hardcore, fast-paced, high-octane game, that's fine. But if you're trying to make a game that appeals to a very wide audience, you have to understand you're going to need some sort of lenience, you're going to need precision, you're going to need latency, you're going to need certain things to help out the people who not only have disabilities and can't actually process or navigate or react as fast, but also for the people that don't have time and don't care. Again, if we're trying to maximize our audience, if we're trying to maximize our sales, we need to focus on the ability to reach the max amount of players, which includes the casual gamers. Thanks everybody for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell to be notified of future videos. If you have any constructive criticism, things that I got wrong, opinions that you have, and I'm sure that you have many, please put them in the comment section below. Please be nice and constructive when you are talking about these things. You can say that I'm wrong, you can tell me that I just got dead wrong and that's fine, but provide evidence. If you just say, you're wrong, get good, I'm gonna ignore those comments. I've seen them plenty of times, I usually look at them, laugh, and then move on. I'm not gonna interact with them. So, make sure you're actually constructive and have some sort of analysis. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week with our gameplay aspect of sustainability. Other than that, that ends it for this video. Thanks everybody for watching. Walete omnes.